Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. On this episode of the Wolf Connection podcast, Stephen and I are happy to welcome over Zoom, joining us from Mammoth Hot Springs, Montana. She's been a research associate for 9 years with the Wolf Project in association with Yellowstone Forever. Kira Cassidy. Kira, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you. How's everything in Montana?
Things are going well. Thank you for having me. It's been a nice start to the winter. It's been actually a pretty extended fall, which we don't get very often. Sometimes it all of a sudden snows in September. So it's been a beautiful fall, and the wolves love the winter the best. So it's their kind of favorite time of year coming up.
What's the current weather situation been like for them?
-5, probably.
Yeah, pretty close, actually, a few times. Today's been nice, although I'm kind of in the lowest elevation part of the park, the far northern entrance area. And up in the higher elevation parts of the park, it's real winter already. It's warm here, but, you know, in the negatives. Certainly, I think tomorrow night's supposed to be in the negatives, but they love it.
That's awesome. Just give everybody a background for yourself. When you first started with the Wolf Project, I was reading a lot up on you yesterday before we started. So yeah, just give everybody when you came to Yellowstone and what your first roles were in the Wolf Project.
Yeah, so I started with the Wolf Project originally as a volunteer for some of these what I'll call, or what we refer to as winter studies. There are these 30-day kind of more intensive time periods where we'll bring in volunteers and assign them to certain packs. And then their assignment is to watch them from sunup to sundown every day for 30 days. And the main goal is to get information on kill rates, what they're eating, take samples, and also behavioral observations. But when I did my first one, that was in 2007. I was in my last semester of my undergraduate research, and I just loved it. I fell in love with the place and really enjoyed the people I was working with and studying wild animals, doing their kind of wild everyday things. So mostly we're watching through spotting scopes and binoculars, so we're not impacting their behavior. Was just kind of a new page for me for watching animals, and to be able to see them go about their daily lives was pretty fascinating. And also seeing all the different personalities in a single pack, I just loved it right away. I ended up getting a year-round technician job here, doing pretty much that same thing, not sunup to sundown every day. That would be totally exhausting. Although when the days in June are about 16 hours long, it's exhausting no matter what, getting up at 4:30 in the morning to try and be out first thing. The wolves love those early morning hours. But I was out pretty much every day collecting information, behavioral data, kill data on what they're preying on. And I did that for a few years before starting a graduate research project. I moved to Minnesota for a few years to do that, to work with a really well-known wolf biologist, Dr. Dave Meach. But I used data that I had collected here in Yellowstone and other people had collected here. When I finished that research, my boss here, Dr. Doug Smith, hired me back in the position that I have now. So I've been in this research associate position now for almost 9 years. And really loving it. It's a pretty exceptional place to live and pretty wonderful species to study. So I feel incredibly lucky.
That's amazing. Wow. So when you were studying them, first of all, what were the packs that you were able to, that when you were volunteering, and then as you've done your research for the last 9 years, what are the packs that you mostly study?
When I started as a volunteer, I was actually studying the Agate Creek pack, which was a long-term pack that they're no longer around, but they were a pretty dominant pack in Yellowstone for quite a while. And then also the famous Druid Peak pack, which many people have probably heard about, people who visited Yellowstone anywhere between 1996, when they were reintroduced, until the time that they kind of disintegrated and fell apart through a series of kind of unfortunate things all coming together in 2009. So I was studying kind of the very tail end, those last few years of the Druid at one of their strongest, and then also as they fell apart. So also a really interesting thing to watch. And as a scientist, to see that kind of play out over the course of a few years and knowing all the history of that pack was really interesting. Since then, other packs have formed and have been kind of the dominant packs in the park. One of the most interesting ones to me is the Mollie's pack. They were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995. Back then, they were actually called the Crystal Creek Pack, so the name has changed one time. But they're still the same lineage all the way down, and they're still living in the same territory now 26 years later, which they're the only pack that even has lasted half, they're the next longest pack has lasted maybe half that long. And so they're a really exceptional story filled with kind of interesting individuals, and all of these wolf stories kind of read like Shakespearean tragedies, I feel like sometimes, because they live such short lives that we experience and we record so many of their deaths. But they're living every day kind of to the fullest. And so that's really fascinating to watch.
That's incredible. Yeah, we had Rick McIntyre on a few weeks ago, and so we went through his two books that he has out right now, or two of his books, with Rise of Wolf 8 and then Reign of Wolf 21. In the Mollie's pack for you, what do you think is some of the factors of why that pack has been able to be sustained for the life of the wolf introduction in Yellowstone?
That's a good question. It seems to be a combination of things. So if we think about what's most dangerous to a wolf living in the wild, in especially a protected place like Yellowstone, it would be running into another wolf pack that accounts for approximately half of all of their mortality. And so if you think about 100 wolves in Yellowstone, 50 of them will end up being killed by other wolves. Far and away the number one cause of mortality. And so Mollies seem to have been really good at avoiding, or at least minimizing, that impact by choosing a really safe territory. They were released in 1995 on the Northern Range, but they were quickly kind of pushed around by the Druid Peak Pack and some others, and Rose Creek, and went down near the lake in Yellowstone and actually established a territory in a place that is really resource rich. And by that, I mean there's tons of elk and bison and even deer in the summer. But in the winter, it becomes this pretty crazy place to live, even for a wolf. There's all the elk migrate out, all the deer are gone for a very long time. There's really only a handful, maybe a few dozen to a few hundred bison in any given year. And so Mollie's made it work every year. They kind of balanced that risk of, we didn't want to live on the Northern Range because that was too much competition between other packs. So we're going to live in this other place that might be really tough to make it during certain times of the year. But like I mentioned before, the winter is the wolves' favorite time of year. It's much easier for them to hunt. They're all traveling together. They can take advantage as the winter wears on and the elk and bison get in poorer and poorer shape. They can take even a big bison down in some cases. Mollie's was the first wolf pack that we recorded actually learning how to kill bison regularly. And it still doesn't happen very often. But I think it was out of necessity, probably from where they chose to live. Also, where they chose to live is pretty remote and there isn't too much of a human impact. And so they don't have too many roads to cross in their territory. So the risk of being hit by a car is very low. Wolves are hunted outside of Yellowstone, and their territory doesn't go outside of the park boundary. And so they're not exposed to hunting by humans. And so they've kind of taken those most risky things that wolves deal with and kind of reduced those dangers to themselves. And I think they've been able to live and thrive in that Pelican Valley area. They will occasionally come up to northern Yellowstone, kind of following the elk in the winter. And as long as they're living in a pretty big pack, they can intrude on these other packs' territories. And they have some success doing that, but they have to be in a big pack. If one year they're fairly small, say only 6 or 7 wolves, they'll stay down in their kind of safe fortress of Pelican Valley. They've also had, I think this is one of the probably most important factors, they've had a number of leaders throughout their 25, almost 26 years now that have been long-term. So they had one female that lived, I think, until she was like 8 or 9. They had her daughter who then took over after her, lived till she was 7 or 8. And so if you have really long-term leaders like that, I think they bring kind of a stability to the pack. And they figured a lot of things out. They figured out how to hunt big things like bison, how to avoid people, avoid other packs, even avoid things like dangerous thermal areas. They pass on that knowledge, and the more time that they can kind of accrue that knowledge, the better for everybody.
What is the dominant cause, I guess, or dominant causes of pack conflict usually? And while you're answering that, what's the other 50% of mortality? How can we account for that?
Yeah, so wolves we know that they're territorial, and it's one of these things that's kind of accepted about wolves, but what drives it is still kind of an unanswered question. It's probably due to fighting for resources between each other. And so they'll have their territories. Sometimes there are overlapping territories, and they need to have access to enough vulnerable prey in order to be successful. And then also access to safe places to raise their pups. Many times where they choose to den is in one of the safest places in their territory, somewhere around the middle. And it makes sense that they're not going to den right on the boundary of their territory and another pack's territory, because they don't want to be at that big of a risk. And so they kind of have to establish these territories. That doesn't mean that they don't intrude every once in a while, especially if they're kind of traveling their own territory and not finding enough food or something, and they're going off into other places like Mollie's pack does occasionally. But I think that their territoriality is definitely driven by being able to find enough food, enough space, and certainly enough safe space to raise their pups. That other 50% of mortality, that is divided up into a bunch of different things. So being killed by other wolves makes up that first 50%. It's far outnumbers any other causes. The second cause is a wolf being killed when they're hunting. So either kicked or gored or something by an elk or a bison, something that they're trying to kill to eat. And that makes up 15% of the mortality. And so if you add those together, it's 65%. We're only left with 35%. And that is completely divided up into these tiny little chunks that are all pretty equal to each other, being hunted by people right outside the park boundary, being hit by vehicles, each make up maybe 7 to 8% or so. And then there are always these kind of freak accidents that happen, like an avalanche or drowning or something. Wolves will occasionally die of disease. And the numbers I'm putting out here are the ones that we have collared, so they're already adults. But there occasionally will have a year where several pups will die of disease. They're a bit more vulnerable. They don't have quite the immune system the adults do yet. And so disease is possible. Malnutrition is possible. We have very rarely recorded it in Yellowstone. Any wolf that dies of malnutrition probably is suffering from something already that's a problem, either a disease that we just weren't able to identify based on, decomposition was too advanced or something, or they had some type of severe injury that we weren't able to kind of pinpoint at the time of the necropsy when we did the autopsy to figure out the cause of death. So number one is definitely the wolf versus wolf conflict.
Wow. And what are the sizes of these boundaries, and do they adjust for pack size?
That's a great question. So territories are flexible, certainly, because wolves will be traveling in one direction. And if a pack lives in a really large group, they can certainly muscle their way around a little bit and push the smaller groups that might be their neighbors, kind of push them around, maybe push into their territory, take over their territory in some cases. So year to year, even season to season, the territory boundaries will shift a bit. It seems like on an annual scale, they're fairly stable. Wolves will, the kind of boundary of that pack territory that we draw doesn't change too much from year to year, unless there's some kind of dramatic thing that happens. A neighbor kicks them out, or they lose both of their leaders and the rest of the pack is kind of in disarray. And so it can happen, but they're fairly stable.
What evidence are you looking at to see that the boundary has changed? Is it hunting habits, or, they move, primary locations or denning sites?
Yeah, denning sites is a really big one. So we've been keeping track of where wolves den since 1995, which is really fascinating because there are many times where they'll reuse den year after year, which is maybe not that surprising. But then once there's a new breeding female in the pack, say the original one dies and a new one takes over, sometimes she'll go back and use that same den that she was maybe born in. Maybe that was a daughter that took over. And so she goes back to where she was born. Occasionally they will dig new dens. We don't really know what triggers that exactly. It might be something like the territory itself shifted a bit, or there's just too much snow to get to that one den that they really want to use in a really high snow year. And even more interesting, we've had territories where the pack actually turns over. So one pack completely dies out, kind of like the Druid Peak pack did. A new pack comes in, forms, takes over that territory. Sometimes they'll use that same den that the first pack used. So it seems like they have these kind of places that they prefer evolutionarily, and it's probably something to do with the microsite. There's already a hole there. It already is kind of in a protected area, but then also it's important where it is in relationship to the rest of the territory, where that territory is in relationship to the other pack.
Right. What does an optimal den look like? How is it different from the rest of the landscape?
So den sites are usually, here in Yellowstone at least, they're about half the time they're underneath the roots of a big Douglas fir tree. I think the roots kind of hold up the ceiling, doesn't allow it to collapse. And then they'll dig all these different holes underneath the roots. And sometimes we can see evidence of like, well, that hole's not quite big enough for an adult wolf. That just seems to be something that a puppy was digging around and playing in. But then they'll also choose some really cool things like in a cave or just underneath a log. One time there was a wolf that denned in this really, it didn't seem like much, but she must have dug into some snow and just kind of under a log. We will visit dens occasionally once the wolves have moved on and left completely, usually in the late summer or early fall. And we'll measure them and look for like remains of dead pups. We hardly ever find any, but just to kind of make sure, and also measure to see the changes year to year since I do use them so often. And there's a den that it was in this kind of like old stair-steppy thermal area that looked like it was all dried up and everything. And I was in the den, actually had this measuring tape, and I was sticking it to the very back. And in the very back of the den, I could feel that it was thermally heated, which in the summer they didn't need, but I was there in August and they were there in April when it was totally covered in snow and probably still, below zero temperatures. And to have these little tiny pups that can't regulate their own body temperature, for the wolves to find a really special place like that. And Yellowstone, of course, is known for its thermal features and geysers and everything. And so it's pretty unique to Yellowstone probably, but that pack may have been able to live in the territory they did because they found that one little spot where they could den and underground be at a nice toasty 50 degrees, even when it's a raging blizzard outside.
Unreal.
Wow. That's incredible. I want to go back to something you were talking about before with the mortality rates. Is it something you and your colleagues have to explain sometimes to the visitors and the public more so than not about how wolves actually die because of fights within other packs and with the animals that they kill, as opposed to possibly the view that they're hunted, and that's the major reason why a lot of wolves eventually die. Is that something you guys have to go over more so than not?
Yeah, I do get asked quite often, what is a wolf's predator? Because I think people are thinking about kind of the, a food web or a food pyramid or something where the grass is eaten by a primary producer, which is, rabbits and deer and elk and things. And those are eaten by these other animals. And then at the top, people think about, well, that must be the apex predator, where really it's more like mushrooms and beetles and things that are eating everything else that has died already, the decomposers. But people think about that kind of pyramid and ask, what is killing a wolf? Because something has to control, there has to be some kind of control on every type of population, every type of species that you have out there. And I think it can be kind of hard for people to understand that wolves control themselves in such a way. And but specifically, I do just make the point to people that this is when two packs run into each other. This is not within the pack. So it's important, I think, to point out that wolves within the pack are actually very friendly with each other. If we can say that wolves love each other, I think that as much as we understand about wolves and dogs, and we understand quite a lot about dogs, they feel very affectionate towards each other. They're very worried when one of their pack mates, one of their friends are, in danger or something. And so what that means to a wolf is that they really feel very strongly that they have to take care of the pack and protect the pack. And that does translate sometimes into fighting off their opponents, which are other wolves. And so it's interesting to me to have kind of these two behaviors that are complete opposites of each other, but reinforcing each other, protect the pack by fighting anyone that's not in the pack. And that's not a complete solid rule. Obviously, new packs are formed by wolves that leave their home packs and start new packs with a stranger. But overall, when two packs run into each other, it's going to be aggressive, most of the time just chasing, but sometimes the wolf is killed. And then sometimes that does kind of quell a bit at certain times of the year, so that new packs are always forming.
Is that something that you see in your research where are there certain times of the year or certain times that you see that they're more apt to run into each other and have those altercations? And do the packs in Yellowstone particularly try to avoid those situations as much as possible, and that only happens at a point where it's absolutely necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of course of aggressive interactions between packs changes pretty dramatically throughout the year. It's at a high in the winter. And this is when the packs are all traveling kind of as a cohesive unit. And when they run into each other, they're much more likely to be aggressive. In the summer, they do this much less because they are pretty focused on taking care of the pups. And so they're kind of all coming back to the den to feed the pups and hang out and sleep, but then they're all leaving kind of like on spokes on a wheel. They'll leave and then come back in these singles or small groups or something. They're much less likely to want to fight if they're traveling in these tiny groups. They're only hunting small things, so they don't need to be in a huge group until the winter. When the pups are big enough to travel with them come October, and when even an elk calf is pretty big, 200 or 300 pounds or so, they have to travel as a big group. And also their testosterone in all the wolves, males and females, are rising starting in about October and hits a peak during the breeding season. That's when we see the most conflicts happening. Although because it's it's kind of overlapping with the breeding season, there are occasions where a wolf is leaving to go try and find a new mate. And so running into a stranger is generally going to be aggressive for a wolf until it's breeding season and they're interested in finding another wolf to perhaps start a new pack.
That makes sense. That answers my winter wolf question. Yeah, because we it's a running, I don't know if it's a joke, but it's a running conversation piece here. And during the winter, we say, winter wolves here. We can kind of tell right when it's starting to happen.
Yeah, more howling, nice thick winter coats. It seems like the wolves here, starting a couple months ago when they were kind of growing their winter coats, they really don't want to be out in the sun. And I talked about there being a really nice fall going on, but for a wolf, they would much rather have the -0 degree temperatures, and the sun is just too much. They want to sleep in the shade when it's that warm.
Yeah.
And I know that you asked about how wolves might avoid those aggressive interactions, which is really interesting, I think. If they know that they can win, I don't know that they'll avoid it. If they live in a big pack, essentially. It seems like they have an idea of this concept of strength in numbers, and even some kind of concept of their relative pack size, so how big they are as opposed to their opponents. And the bigger they are, as opposed to whoever they might run into, their neighbors, the more kind of confidence they have when they're kind of traveling around, and they can intrude more. And so they might not avoid fights in that way. But it is dangerous for them. And so even though 50% of the mortality is caused by these fights between packs, we rarely actually see it happen. We might see a fight here and there, but it's chasing and that's it. So we probably miss quite a bit of what's going on. Most of the wolves that we have found dead, killed by other wolves, we actually track out just by hearing the radio collar switch into a mortality mode, which is just signaling to us that the wolf hasn't moved, the collar hasn't moved for 4 hours. And so the beep that we're hearing as we're tracking them is actually double paced. And so we can track it out then and try and figure out what happened based on their injuries, based on their tracks around, and based on the radio collared signals that we hear from maybe another pack that was in the area.
Have you ever been part of the collaring process? Because I know when I've read Rick's books and I've done some research, I know Doug he seems like he's in the helicopter every day or every week. Have you ever been part of those collaring processes and gathering the data that way?
Yes. So every year we radio collar somewhere between 12 and 20 wolves, depending on what's needed. We'll put out new collars and then replace old collars that their battery is dying or they malfunctioned or something. Doug is in the helicopter with the dart rifle. So he is often the one, he's hooked in there, although I know it looks like in the pictures he's hanging out of the side of a helicopter. And we will discuss before he goes up which wolves we want to radio collar, so he can actually choose and guide the pilot which one to follow as they're going. They will usually have us in the helicopter before that and then drop us off. They drop us off so that the helicopter has less weight in it and they can actually be a bit more maneuverable and chase the wolves a little bit easier, because the wolves are super fast. We need deep snow in order to be able to dart them, because if there's not deep snow, they can just run like a greyhound. They're incredibly fast. But once they have darted a couple of wolves, they'll come back and pick myself and 2 other employees up, and they'll bring us to where Doug is with the drugged wolves. And so we'll have all of the equipment and then start putting on the radio collars, taking the blood samples, taking all the measurements, monitoring the wolves' health as they're metabolizing the drug and starting to wake up. Some of them wake up really quickly. And it's interesting because it seems to be the young wolves. So we will only dart wolves as young as like 9 months or so, because they're pretty much full grown at that point. But those youngest wolves, and then some of the female wolves, will sometimes only be out for half hour, 45 minutes or so before they're trying to stand up and walk away. But the big adult males are sometimes conked out for 4 hours. I think it's because they have more fat, and it probably has to do with metabolizing the drug.
Yeah.
But there's some pretty funny times they'll be like snoring and yawning and stuff. Getting a great nap, it seems like.
I mean, so what are you, just go through, what are you collecting at that point? How long does that take? Obviously, if you have a window, like you said, between possibly a half hour and 4 hours, what are some of the basic numbers and research data that you're trying to get in that amount of time? And how much do the collars weigh, by the way? Because I always want to ask that question. And I've had Rick and Jim on, and I totally forgot to ask. So okay, you have one there. Perfect. If those of you who can't see it, it looks basically like a big...
So it's essentially like a leather reinforced band that goes around the neck. This one that I'm holding up here actually has these kind of metal rivets throughout it because we try to discourage them from chewing on them. They can't reach it themselves, but sometimes they'll allow their friends to chew on it. And if they do that too much, they can actually damage the hardware. Or in some cases, a pack has been known to chew them off completely. So this is the metal is to try to discourage that. And then there's this kind of box at the bottom of the collar that goes underneath the wolf's chin, which is mostly battery. It's about the size of, 2 decks of cards or so, 2.5 decks of cards. And the hardware in here is just the battery plus the transmitter that allows us to hear the individual frequencies. And I want to say, I haven't actually weighed this, but I want to say it's maybe up to 2 pounds. It might be slightly less than that, 1.5 to 2 pounds or so. And there are veterinarians that for decades now have been looking at this to try and anything that you would put on an animal, any type of radio collar, any type of band on a bird, or like a backpack transmitter or something on an eagle, they have to be approved by veterinarians. And so this is approved. We could get collars that weigh quite a bit much more than this, up to 5 pounds, I think it is, based on a wolf's average body weight. But we like to keep them small. There are some collars now that they make that have video cameras in them. So they just weigh a lot. So we're hoping that those types of cameras eventually get smaller and smaller so that we can maybe use them someday.
Yeah.
But during capture, so we'll put on the radio collar. We actually fit them pretty snug so that they don't kind of knock around, especially when the wolves lose their winter coat and they're in their summer coat. We don't want it to rub up and down really. But I can fit about 3 fingers kind of inside the band of the collar in the wolf's fur pretty easily. And that seems to be about a perfect fit. The young male wolves, we might fit a little bit loose because they're the only ones that we think might actually bulk up a little bit. And if they reach, 4 and 5 years old and they're at their peak, we don't want that collar to be too tight. And so we're real careful about how we fit those ones, especially. We take blood samples. We send in whole blood to these different labs. Princeton University is one, but also UCLA is another canine genetics lab that we use. And they have actually, since wolves were reintroduced in 1995, have had this pedigree. So we know all the wolves that were reintroduced. And then we have wolves that have kind of filled in the gaps, all the 6 or 7 generations we are now since the reintroduction. And it's a really cool kind of family tree. And Jim hopefully talked about that Ancestry.com project that kind of shows the entire wolf family tree since reintroduction. And we also take some blood that we can actually spin down in a centrifuge. So it essentially spins out the red blood cell parts, and we can take the serum and test it for different antibodies so we can figure out what diseases the wolves have been exposed to, which is pretty important when we want to know how things change throughout time in the system and what they've been exposed to in the past versus what might have come through just that particular year. We have occasionally had years where hardly any pups survived, and it had to be disease related. And the reason we figured that out was testing the serum from the ones that lived for certain diseases. In this case, it was canine distemper virus, which many of the adults are able to fight off and they're okay, but the pups just don't have the antibodies or the immune system quite yet.
In the collecting of this data, what does this help you to do? Like, what's the plan with this extensive data collection? What does it help you to do as conservationists and biologists, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. So the Wolf Project, when they were formed in 1995, has kind of had a very broad approach to this long-term monitoring. So collect kind of as much as we can, keep up these long-term studies like winter study, bringing people in twice a year, collecting data to try and see how things change on a really long-term basis. And this is not very common in wildlife research. Really, these long-term projects that last for decades, that don't have gaps in the data time period where it's been collected, that are also based on individual animals, that are not just population-based level studies. These are actually collaring individuals, sometimes following them throughout their entire life.
Wow. It's
just really uncommon. There are a handful of these studies in Africa that were started, I think, in the 60s. Jane Goodall's chimpanzees in Gombe. There are some others that were started right after that. Mountain gorillas, lions, and I think a few others like cheetahs, and maybe even a few in Asia like tigers. But really, this is one of the longest ones in North America. There is a wolf study that's been going on Isle Royale National Park, which is an island in Lake Superior. Mm-hmm. That one's been going on for, I think, almost 60 years now. And really, the Yellowstone Wolf Project is the one that's been going on the longest since that, at 26 years. And so we're hoping with long-term monitoring that we can collect enough information each year that we kind of get a good idea of these questions that we would never even come up with 20 years ago. And then also we take on new projects every so often, every few years, that people will maybe just need the information for a few years. So an example of this are during capture, we actually were taking biopsies from the ear to send to these labs because they were essentially growing wolf cells, kind of like stem cell research, where they will grow the cells and then test those cells' reactions against certain things that they can throw at it, different viruses, different funguses, different bacteria, wow. Even parasites. And so try and see how a wolf is reacting to this stuff in a lab setting. It's wolf cells, so it really is a wolf in some sense. But we don't have to kind of try and figure it out in the wild because it would be very difficult. Sometimes we only capture a wolf once in its entire life, sometimes 0 times. There are plenty of uncollared wolves in the population. In fact, I think 3 out of every 4 are uncollared throughout their whole life. So we have kind of a set number that we'll follow. But it really does kind of blend together this idea of broad, long-ranging research, hoping to capture as much information at as long of a time period as possible to answer these really big questions that you can't answer in tiny time snippets. And then also kind of supplemented by these shorter-term projects that are things like that stem cell research, or we had a wolf in Yellowstone die and we sent his sample to the genetics lab, and they actually were able to write the entire Canis lupus genome. And this was, I think, in 2010 or 11 or so. But the gray wolf genome was totally mapped using a wolf in Yellowstone.
That's incredible. I want to touch on this too with a lot of what you talked about, because we both watched your TED Talk where you were talking about elders in the wolf pack and how that relates to us as humans, and how there's a different sense of how elders are treated in wolf packs, and how in human society it's sort of drifted away from revering elders or understanding what elders have and the knowledge they have. What are some of the, break down some of the things that you found out through your research with elders inside these packs and the decisions they really have to make in terms of denning and even getting in altercations or not getting in altercation?
Yeah, so this was one thing that really shocked me at first when I was trying to run this analysis to try and figure out which packs win whenever they run into each other. I really thought that it would just be the bigger pack wins. And that did end up important, but it was actually more important for a pack to have an old wolf present. And so I think the best way of thinking about this is if you live in a pack of 5, you are better off if one of those 5 wolves is old than you are by just gaining a 6th wolf. And I couldn't figure it out at first. I thought that the maybe most important age category would be the ones that are fit, young and fit, top kind of physical fitness of their whole life, maybe 2 to 5 years old or so. But because it ended up old, I started going back to the research and the literature on other animals to try and figure out why this might be. And I ended up finding some really cool studies done by other people on things like elephants and killer whales, showing that during a really stressful time period, the group looks to the oldest one. And this same thing with wolves, where they're in a fight with another pack, looking to the oldest one to guide them, seem to fit that same pattern. So elephants that are traveling around are led by a matriarch, of course, who may be 50 or 60 years old. And during a drought, the whole herd looks to her to try and find water. She might remember where there was water in the last drought that was decades ago. And so they're looking to her during that stressful time. Same thing with killer whales. So when killer whales are normally swimming, they are splitting pretty equally who they're following, either the adult males, the adult females, or the really old adult females. So they actually call them grandmothers, because killer whales actually go through a menopause. And so she doesn't have calves of her own. She's just helping to raise the rest of the family, her grand calves, so to speak. And so they're following them until there's a salmon shortage. Then they all follow grandma, because she remembers during the last salmon shortage where they're supposed to go to find food when it was this really stressful time. And I think that we have found the same thing with wolves. So during the most stressful thing that a wolf can endure, running into another pack, that dangerous situation where their life might be on the line, they look to those oldest ones to help guide them. And it's not that those oldest ones are necessarily fighting all out. They're maybe fighting here and there, but it seems like they are kind of guiding their pack to not panic. So I've watched a number of these fights before, and what happens is two packs will either see each other, or one will see one and the other one will be kind of oblivious, maybe eating on a carcass or something. Either way, they'll come together, chasing will start, and the pack that wins is actually the one that's able to recover the quickest. This chasing usually goes on for 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds. The wolves even are very confused. We'll see them chasing their pack mates sometime and then like, oops, sorry, kind of like meet up with, okay, we're okay. So now we're together and we're chasing another one. And they're all very confused. It's very chaotic. But then pretty quickly, within that minute or two, one of the packs seems to kind of not panic, group back together. It doesn't even have to be all of them. It can just be a handful of them together. And then they start chasing their opponents in singles or in pairs and splitting them up, preventing them from doing that regroup where they'll kind of get a couple of them back together. At the center of that group that comes together is usually the old wolf. And so with any type of animal, a wolf or an animal can be a leader, but it wouldn't matter if none of the rest of its pack mates looked to it. So that's kind of the other half of the story. This wolf is a leader, and all of the rest of its pack mates will look to it during that stressful time. So both things have to happen. And then we measured those wins and losses by the pack that is able to displace the other pack. So that one that's able to recover right away with that old wolf in the middle, with their pack mates kind of coalescing around them, not letting the other pack regroup in the same way, they're the ones that win in the end, which might sound pretty short term, really. They just displace the other group for that day, that other pack for that day. But if you do that over and over and over again as a wolf pack, and you're really successful in doing that, maybe with the same neighbor, you're probably able to kind of bump into their territory, push them around a little bit, take over resources, maybe take over some good territory that would be, good wintering ground for elk, or a calving ground, or a great place to have a new den or something. And so this is when we start seeing packs that have figured out these fights really well, usually with that old adult wolf in it, like Mollies, those older females that were in the pack for a long time, really successful in these fights that kind of, that success just bleeds over into everything else that's important to a wolf, raising pups, finding food.
What age are these elder wolves?
We used 6 years old as kind of the cutoff to designate a wolf as being old. They really only usually live to be 3.5, maybe 4 years old or so, the ones that live through their kind of pup months. So their lives are really short and fast. And by the time they're 6 years old, they've outlived, I think, most of their litter mates, if not every single one. When we look back on the numbers for about every 100 wolves that are born in Yellowstone, only one of them makes it to 10 years old. So only a handful are making it to 6. Right now, the oldest wolf in Yellowstone is the alpha female of the Wapiti Lake Pack. And she is 10.5. So one of the older ones that we've recorded so far. The oldest one ever died a few years ago. She was 12.5.
Wow.
But the female right now, that's the oldest, her mother lived until she was 11. Her mother before her, so the grandmother, lived until I think she was about 8. So she comes from a very long line of long-lived, successful females. So it's really cool to think that there might be some knowledge that was passed down generation to generation that has made her and her pack so successful.
So even 6-year-old wolves or 10-year-old wolves, they're most likely to die due to the pack conflict.
Yeah, that's right. So the handful of wolves that we've had reach 12 years old, their chances of dying every year go up just with their age, as they're kind of coming to the end of their natural life anyway. And so a few of them have died what we think a natural death of old age, because we'll just find their body and sometimes their bones in a very benign place where it doesn't look like there was any kind of fight. It doesn't look like anything really dramatic happened at all. That's very rare in a wolf's life. But generally, if they're still running into other packs, the risk of being killed in that way is still going to be there.
Yeah. I remember reading the end of Wolf 8, Rick's book, and I think when Jim Halfpenny did the necropsy, it was, he had been kicked a lot by elk and bison, and he was missing, I think, 3 out of his 4 canines. And it gets to the point where the physical wear and tear, right, is a lot of...
It's a rough life.
Yeah, it's a rough life that they go through. Once they get, like you said, 6 years old, it makes it seem like they are sometimes 10 or 12, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really rough life, and we'll see wolves all of a sudden one day they'll just have a really severe limp and not put any weight. We can actually see occasionally we have recollared wolves that have been healing from some kind of injury, and see that, this bone is at a really strange angle. So it has at one point been a compound fracture and the bone has kind of regrown around to protect that injury, calcification or ossification forming. And they just go on with their life. They're super resilient, super incredible, really tough. We had one wolf that was kicked in the face a couple years ago. His jaw, one side of it was completely shattered. And for reasons that I think we could say that because a wolf is always moving its jaw a tiny bit, it wasn't able to really calcify like, say, a long bone would have been able to. And so it had these kind of bone shards in there that were all trying to form. And he lived for another 4 months. He actually killed an elk on the last day of his life by himself. And so if you can think about a human that has a broken jaw, we would be either in the hospital or on bed rest, hopped up on painkillers and eating through a straw for months. And this wolf was out there living in the wild and killed an elk by himself. So they constantly amaze me how tough they are.
I know you have a heart out. I don't want to keep you too much longer, Kira. Do you have anything else, Stephen, that you want to ask your question that you always ask? Or?
No. Oh, well, yeah. The end question.
Yeah, I'll ask. So we do have one more question for you, Kira, before we let you go, and then we'll get to. I want to promote obviously the project and where people can find the information and some of the work that you guys have done. So when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
When I hear the word wolf, it seems to be, there's a couple layers to this. So I think I just gave it away in my last answer. I do think tough. They are incredibly resilient. We've seen them, like we were talking about, with some pretty devastating injuries, just pulling through. We've had at the pack, that's just at the individual level. And then at the pack level, we've had wolves packs that have lost really important members, leaders of their pack, and somehow been able to pull through. The Mollie's pack, I think, is one of the best examples I can think of. They lost their alpha male, or their dominant male, to being kicked by a bull elk one summer a few years ago. And the female, normally that would be a breeding opening that she would allow another wolf to join, meet an unrelated male, allow him to join and have a new pair or have a new partner. And she decided instead, for whatever reason, to lead the pack for over a year by herself. And so it was her 16 offspring at the time. She's one of those wolves that lived for a pretty long time. So one of these old leaders that are, well-versed in what it makes a wolf successful in Yellowstone. And so I just think they're incredibly tough. And the next level up is kind of at this population level, or wolves in their range, so throughout North America. And I just think about what the range looked like when I was born in the mid-'80s versus what it looks like now versus what it could look like in 10 years from now, with wolves living in places that I really never would have imagined. I would have thought it's too hard. There's too many people. There's too many roads. There's too many people that hate them, or whatever it might be. And for whatever reason, because they're so incredibly persistent and tough, that they are able to kind of make it happen. There are wolves in Oregon and Washington and California that weren't there when I started working here out in the West for the first time. And there may be wolves in other places over the next decade. And I think that's a really exciting thing to think about. And so I think I would just wrap it all up in saying that they're tough at every level: the individual, the pack, the population, and the species as a whole.
And I guess Colorado's next.
Yeah, we'll see. It seems like some of them have made it down there already, have kind of hop, skip, jumped through some dangerous places in Wyoming, and then maybe even through Utah. And then we'll see what happens with the now reintroduction plan.
Yeah. It's definitely so. The future is definitely exciting. That's for sure. We're probably going to see Kira down in Colorado at some point, I would imagine, play from Yellowstone. So please.
All these conservation stories, it can be hard to kind of find the positive or find like the happy stories in conservation. And even though wolves are a controversial species still, and there are people who are opposed to them, they still bring some pretty exciting news, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Please give people the websites and the social medias where they can find the work that you guys do. So have at it. Yeah, so the Yellowstone National Park has a really amazing gray wolf page that has tons of our research, links to all of our annual reports. That's going to be just, if you search for Yellowstone National Park gray wolf, there's a bunch of different pages. But if you find the top one, you can kind of link to a bunch of different videos that we've done talking about wolves, a bunch of cool photos of wolves, and follow us there. Awesome. That's tremendous. Kira, thank you so much for joining us and for doing this at the last minute. I know you're between webinars, but just anytime you want to come back, if there's any new research, please reach out to us. We'd love to have you back on and continue the conversation, and just any new information you have. We'd love to get it out to everybody. That sounds great. There's always new questions to come up with. It's a pretty wonderful place to do science out here. That's awesome. Thank you, Kira, so much. Howls to everybody out there, and we will talk to you all next time. Bye, everybody.